Eleanor Hayes pressed her gloved hand against the cold train window, watching the endless prairie stretch before her like an ocean of grass. At 28, she had made a decision that would have scandalized her family back in Boston, if she still had family to scandalize. The letter in her traveling bag, worn from countless readings, promised a new life as the wife of Joseph Thornton, a widowed farmer in Nebraska with a modest homestead and a need for companionship. The year was 1887, and Eleanor was one of thousands of women who had answered matrimonial advertisements, seeking fresh starts in the untamed West. She had been a schoolteacher in Massachusetts until the academy closed, leaving her with few prospects and fewer options. The death of her elderly aunt, with whom she'd lived, had left her truly alone in the world. When she saw Mr. Thornton's advertisement in the matrimonial newspaper, something in his simple, honest words had touched her heart. Widower, 35, seeks educated woman of good character for marriage. Must be kind and patient. Farm life is hard but honest. Will provide comfortable home. They had exchanged 5 letters over 3 months. His penmanship was rough but earnest. He wrote of his wheat fields, the harsh winters, the beauty of sunrise over the plains. He mentioned, almost casually in his 3rd letter, that he had children. Several was the word he'd used. Eleanor had assumed 2, perhaps 3. She herself had always longed for children, though spinsterhood had seemed her certain fate. Now, as the train lurched to a stop at the small station in Millbrook, Nebraska, Eleanor's heart hammered with anticipation and fear. She smoothed her navy traveling dress, adjusted her hat, and gripped her carpetbag tightly. The platform was nearly empty, just a few ranchers loading supplies and an elderly stationmaster sweeping dust that would return within minutes. But no Joseph Thornton. Eleanor waited, searching every face. 20 minutes passed. An hour. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and she moved to the shade of the station house. Had he changed his mind? Had something prevented him from coming? Worse, had the whole thing been some cruel deception? Ma'am? Are you Miss Hayes? A small voice broke through her anxious thoughts. Eleanor turned to see a boy of about 12, thin and sunburned, with anxious blue eyes that seemed too old for his face. Behind him stood 6 other children, ranging from what appeared to be 16 down to a tiny girl of perhaps 4, clutching a cloth doll. I am, Eleanor managed, her confusion evident. I'm Thomas Thornton, the boy said, twisting his cap in his hands. Pa sent us to fetch you. He couldn't come himself. Eleanor's breath caught. Is he ill? The children exchanged glances. The oldest, a girl with auburn hair pulled severely back, stepped forward. Ma'am, I'm Sarah. I'm 16. Perhaps we should talk in the wagon. The ride to the Thornton farm took 40 minutes along a rutted dirt road. The children were silent, and Eleanor's mind spun with possibilities. 7 children. 7. And an absent husband. What had she gotten herself into? The farmhouse finally appeared on the horizon, a 2-story structure that had once been white, now weathered gray. Outbuildings surrounded it, a barn, a chicken coop, a smokehouse. It was larger than she'd expected, but clearly struggling, with missing fence rails and a sagging porch step. As the wagon stopped, Sarah turned to Eleanor with eyes that held both fear and desperate hope. Miss Hayes, I need to tell you something before we go inside. Pa died 3 weeks ago. Fever took him sudden-like. We didn't know how to tell you. We thought if you came all this way, maybe. Her voice broke. Eleanor sat frozen, the prairie wind whipping loose strands of hair across her face. She had traveled 1,000 miles to marry a dead man. She was stranded in Nebraska with 7 orphaned children staring at her with a mixture of terror and longing. She had 2 choices, demand return passage on the next train, or stay with these desperate children who had gambled everything on her kindness. Eleanor looked at each small face, then at the 4-year-old clutching her doll. What's your name, sweetheart? She asked gently. Lily, the child whispered. Eleanor made her decision. The inside of the farmhouse told the story of Joseph Thornton's final desperate months. Dishes were stacked haphazardly, laundry piled in corners, and a layer of dust covered most surfaces. But beneath the chaos, Eleanor could see evidence of former care: hand-sewn curtains, a beautiful oak table, carefully arranged photographs of a woman who must have been the first Mrs. Thornton. Sarah led her upstairs to a small bedroom, barely large enough for the narrow bed and washstand it contained. "This was going to be, for you and Pa," she said quietly. "I'll sleep with the little ones now." That first evening, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table as the 7 children gathered around, their faces a mixture of hope, suspicion, and exhaustion. Sarah had introduced them all: Thomas at 12, then Margaret, 10, the twins Samuel and Simon, 8, Catherine, 6, and little Lily, who hadn't spoken since that first whispered introduction. "I won't lie to you," Eleanor began, her schoolteacher's voice steady despite her churning stomach. "I came here expecting a very different situation. But I'm here now, and I can see you need help." "We can pay you," Sarah blurted. "To stay, I mean. As a housekeeper. Pa had some money saved, and the farm, if we can bring in the harvest, we'll have wheat to sell. Thomas and I can manage most of the farm work, but the little ones they need a mother," Eleanor finished gently. The room fell silent. Margaret began to cry quietly. Catherine reached for Eleanor's hand, and that small gesture decided everything. Over the next weeks, Eleanor learned the true situation. Joseph Thornton's first wife, Mary, had died giving birth to Lily 4 years ago. Joseph had struggled valiantly to manage the farm and raise the children alone, but the previous winter had been brutal. He'd written to Eleanor in a last burst of hopeful desperation. The fever that took him came suddenly. He was working in the fields one day and gone 3 days later. Sarah, at 16, had been trying to hold everything together. She cooked, though her bread was like rocks. She attempted laundry, though everything came out gray. She kept the younger ones fed and relatively clean while Thomas handled the livestock. But the weight on her young shoulders was crushing. Eleanor established routines immediately. She'd run a household before and knew that structure was especially crucial in chaos. Mornings meant breakfast at 6, then chores divided by age and ability. The older boys helped Thomas with farm work. Margaret and Catherine handled chickens and the vegetable garden. Sarah learned proper cooking and cleaning techniques, though Eleanor was careful to praise rather than criticize her previous attempts. "You've kept them alive and together," Eleanor told her one evening. "That's extraordinary, Sarah. Now let me help you do more than just survive." The challenges were enormous. Eleanor had to learn farming while teaching it to children. Her schoolteacher's salary had never prepared her for the complexities of irrigation, wheat diseases, or livestock management. But she was intelligent and resourceful, and the Thornton children, hungry for stability and affection, became her eager students in this shared education. Lily, the youngest, slowly emerged from her shell. She began following Eleanor everywhere, tiny shadow with a cloth doll permanently attached to her side. One morning, while Eleanor was mixing bread dough, Lily suddenly spoke, "Are you going to be our mama?" Eleanor knelt down, her floury hands forgotten. "Would you like that?" Lily nodded solemnly. "Then yes," Eleanor whispered, pulling the child close. "Yes, I will." The community of Millbrook had been watching the situation with great interest. A mail-order bride arriving to a house full of orphans was the kind of story that spread quickly in isolated prairie towns. Some women came offering help, casseroles, advice, children's outgrown clothes. Others came with judgment, suggesting the children should be separated and sent to relatives or, worse, an orphanage. Eleanor met each visitor with polite firmness. "These children belong together," she stated clearly. "This is their home, and I intend to keep them in it." But good intentions couldn't pay the bank note that came due in September. The letter from Millbrook First Bank arrived on an August morning when the wheat fields were golden and nearly ready for harvest. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the formal language: mortgage payment overdue, final notice, foreclosure proceedings to begin October 1st. Joseph had fallen behind before his death, and Eleanor's small savings had gone toward immediate necessities: food, clothes for rapidly growing children, medicine when Simon developed a bad cough. The amount due seemed impossible: $200. That night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with Sarah and Thomas. At 16 and 12, they were old enough to understand. Sarah cried silently while Thomas's jaw clenched with helpless anger. "If we lose the farm, they'll split us up," Sarah whispered. "The county will say I'm old enough for domestic service, send the middle ones to families who want workers, and Lily, orphanages take the little ones." "That will not happen," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "We have the wheat. If we can harvest and sell it in time, we'll have the money. It will be close, but it's possible." What Eleanor didn't say was that harvesting 20 acres of wheat required a crew of experienced workers, not a woman who'd never farmed and 7 children. The community harvest crews were already committed to larger farms owned by established families. Joseph's fields would likely be last priority, if anyone came at all. But Eleanor had learned something important in her months on the prairie: necessity bred innovation, and love bred miracles. She approached Reverend Matthews after Sunday service. "I need to hire your congregation," she said simply. "Not for money, I have none. But I can offer shares of the harvest, and every meal cooked better than most ranch cooking. I need strong backs for 3 days, and I need them next week." The Reverend looked at the 7 Thornton children standing behind her, clean and well-behaved, noticeably healthier than they'd been months ago. He'd heard stories about the Eastern schoolteacher who'd stayed when she had every reason to run. "I'll see what I can do," he said. The following Tuesday, Eleanor woke at dawn to find 12 wagons parked around her property. Men she barely knew were sharpening scythes and checking equipment. Their wives were setting up tables for the communal meals Eleanor had promised. The widow Chen, who ran the general store, had brought supplies on credit. Even the banker, Mr. Peterson, arrived with his 2 teenage sons. "Heard you might need hands," he said gruffly, not meeting Eleanor's eyes. "Boys need to learn honest work." For 3 days, the community cut wheat under the late summer sun. Eleanor and the older women cooked vast quantities of food: biscuits, roasts, pies made from the Thornton's struggling apple trees. The children worked alongside the adults, even little Catherine gathering fallen stalks, even Lily bringing water to tired workers. Thomas drove the wagon to the grain elevator in town, multiple trips hauling the precious wheat. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, counting each load, calculating desperately. Would it be enough? On the 3rd evening, Thomas returned with a small leather pouch. Inside, $247. Eleanor's legs nearly gave out with relief. The following morning, she marched into Millbrook First Bank with Thomas, Sarah, and the pouch of money. Mr. Peterson counted it twice, made careful notations, then stamped the mortgage papers, paid in full. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, then stopped, realizing his mistake. "Miss Hayes, I mean. I apologize." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "Actually, Mr. Peterson, I've been thinking about that." She pulled out a document she'd had the county clerk prepare. "I'm filing for legal guardianship of the Thornton children. And I'm keeping the name. They're my family now, and this is the Thornton farm. I may not have married Joseph, but I made promises to his children that I intend to keep." The banker looked at the determined woman before him, and slowly nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Thornton. I believe you will." The first winter was hard. Nebraska winters always were, but Eleanor had never experienced cold that crept through every crack, that turned morning wash water to ice, that made the short walk to the barn an expedition. But the house was full of laughter now, of children's voices and the warmth of a family learning to be whole again. Sarah taught Eleanor how to render lard and put up preserves. Eleanor taught Sarah proper grammar and how to calculate interest, insisting the girl would attend the normal school in Lincoln someday. Thomas became Eleanor's right hand on the farm, growing into his father's role with quiet competence. The middle children thrived with structure and affection, their nightmares faded, their laughter came easier. And Lily, silent for so long, became the most talkative of all, chattering constantly to her Mama Eleanor about everything from the chickens to the clouds to the stories Eleanor read them each night. In the spring, Eleanor started a school in the Thornton parlor. 3 neighboring families, hearing about her teaching credentials, asked if their children could attend. She charged modest fees that helped with farm expenses, and suddenly the house was full of students each weekday. Sarah assisted her, discovering a gift for teaching younger children. The community's attitude shifted. The curiosity and judgment transformed into respect. Eleanor Thornton, for she had legally changed her name, became known as a woman of remarkable character. She served on the church committee, organized a lending library, and never hesitated to help other struggling families. Marriage proposals came, of course. Millbrook had more single men than women, and a proven mother with a working farm was quite a catch. But Eleanor politely declined each offer. She had her family. She had her purpose. She had discovered that love didn't require romance, that the fierce, protective love she felt for 7 children was more than enough to fill her heart. Years passed, measured in harvests and school years, in height marks on the kitchen doorframe, in the gradual transformation of orphans into confident young people. Sarah went to normal school at 18, returning 2 years later to teach at Millbrook's expanded schoolhouse. She married a teacher from Lincoln, and Eleanor helped plan a beautiful wedding in the farmhouse parlor. Thomas took over the farm completely, proving to have his father's talent for agriculture and his mother's head for business. He added acreage, improved yields, and became the youngest member of the County Agricultural Association. Margaret became a nurse, inspired by the care Eleanor had shown during their various childhood illnesses. The twins opened a carpentry business together in town. Catherine studied music and taught piano lessons. And Lily, the silent 4-year-old who had whispered that first question, grew into a teacher like her mama Eleanor, specializing in children who struggled to speak or learn. On a warm evening in 1902, 15 years after Eleanor's arrival, the entire family gathered for Sunday dinner, now including spouses and grandchildren. Eleanor, 53 years old and silver-haired, looked around her crowded table and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Tell the story, Mama," Lily's daughter begged. "About when you came on the train." Eleanor smiled, catching Sarah's eye across the table. "Your grandma arrived expecting to marry a man she'd never met," Sarah began, taking up the familiar tale. "Instead, she found 7 terrified children and an impossible situation. But she stayed," Thomas continued, his own children listening raptly. "She saved us," Margaret added softly. "No," Eleanor corrected gently, as she always did when they told this story. "You saved me. I was alone in the world, with no purpose and no family. You gave me both. I came here thinking I would be completing someone else's family. Instead, you completed mine." Little Thomas, Sarah's 5-year-old son, climbed into Eleanor's lap. "Great-grandma, tell about the harvest." As Eleanor began the story, told hundreds of times but never growing old, she reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. She had boarded a train to marry a stranger and found something far more precious: 7 children who needed her, a community that respected her, and a life rich with purpose and love. She had come to Nebraska expecting to be a mail-order bride. Instead, she became exactly what those 7 waiting children had dreamed of: a real mother, faithful and true, who chose them every single day.